Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started here in just a moment. On behalf of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network here at NYU Law, I am so thrilled to welcome you to tonight's book talk. We have a double header tonight, so we're so excited for these two phenomenal new releases. First, we have Right Within, How to Heal from Racial Trauma in the Workplace by Minda Harts, which offers strategies for women of color to speak up during racialized moments with managers and clients and reframe past career disappointments as opportunities to grow. The second book we have tonight is Inclusion on Purpose, an intersectional approach to creating a culture of belonging at work by Ruchika Tulshyan, which addresses how organizations can foster diversity, equity, and inclusion and take action to address and prevent workplace bias while centering women of color. We're so excited to pair these two authors and their books for tonight's conversation, addressing both individual and institutional strategies for advancing women of color's careers. So tonight, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors. We have NYU's Office of Global Diversity, Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, the NYU Women's Leadership Forum, NYU Stern's Center for the Future of Management, NYU Law's Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, the Law Alumni of Color Association, the Women of Color Collective, and NYU Wagner's Black Student Association. So this is truly a cross NYU effort, and we are so grateful for everyone's support and for bringing all of these important books to a wider audience. So before I introduce our moderator, a few logistics. Captioning is available, so you can turn that on as needed at the bottom of your screen. You can also please submit questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And finally, if you haven't already, we really hope that you'll all buy and read these important books. So we'll have links for all of this in the chat. But most importantly, now I'd like to turn things over and introduce our moderator tonight. We have our moderator, Dr. Lisa Coleman, who is NYU's inaugural Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation. So in that role, she works to build capacity for strategic global inclusion, diversity, equity, belonging, and innovation across NYU. And prior to NYU, she worked at Harvard and Tufts and earned her doctorate at NYU and 3 master's degrees from Ohio State. So we are so thrilled to have her here moderating this conversation. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Coleman, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Abigail, and thank you to the entire team who've been able to bring this together, everyone behind the scenes. We're so happy to be here with you tonight. And my job really is to bring on the speakers, and so let me get to it. First, let me start by introducing one of our first panelists, Minda Harts. Minda Harts is a workplace and equity consultant and CEO and founder of the Memo LLC, a career development company for women of color. She is the award-winning author of 2 books, The Memo, and Right Within, and has the 3rd book, You Are More Than Magic, coming out this year. She's an adjunct professor, and we're lucky to have her at NYU's Wagner School of Public Service, and as a frequent guest, in case you haven't seen her, on MSNBC. She's been featured on ABC News, Forbes, Fast Company, and Time Magazine. In 2020, she was named the top voice for equity in the workplace by LinkedIn. Minda hosts a weekly career podcast for professional women of color called Secure the Seat. And if you haven't tuned into that, you should do that as well. It's really an excellent, excellent podcast. Secondly, our next panelist, Ruchika Tulshyan. She is an award-winning inclusion strategist. Through her company, Candor, she advises global companies on diversity, equity, and inclusion, strategy, and communications. She is the author of 2 books, The Diversity Advantage, Fixing Gender Equality in the Workplace, and Inclusion on Purpose. And let me say again, as Abigail said, get the books, buy the books, read the books, pass them on to your friends. She writes regularly for the New York Times and Harvard Business Review on workplace equity, and in 2019 was named the Thinkers 50 on the Radar list, and was also named to the Hive Learning list of the most influential D&I leaders. She is Singaporean and has lived and worked on 4 continents. So we're gonna have a wonderful discussion, and we're gonna learn a lot. So let's get to it. So And let me just say on a personal note, it is humbling and honoring to be in conversation with the two of you. I admire your work, and I was saying this earlier. I was watching a lot of videos of you all, so I'm just terrifically excited to be here. So let's start. So we're going to first talk about what brought you to this work. And so I'll ask both of you this question, and I'll start with, I think I'll start with you, Rashika, since I started by introducing Minda first. So what brought you to DE and I work, and in particular to writing your books, right? So what sort of paved the way, or what brought you to do that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. And can I just say what an honor it is to be here, and especially be in the company of the great Minda Harts, someone whom I've been lucky to call a friend, read both of her first two books, and now eagerly awaiting for You're More Than Magic, the book I wish I had as a young girl of color growing up in a country that didn't often have space for someone who looked like me. So what brought me to this work, to answer your question, is sadly quite a lot of pain and trauma. And this is something that Minda and I have connected over. And and this is part of my privilege. I kind of thought that, it doesn't matter what I look like. It doesn't matter my gender. It doesn't matter my race. It doesn't matter, where I was born. What matters is I go to good colleges, good universities. I get those top degrees. And then, the world is set for me, because obviously that's what matters, right? And facing in many, both subtle and overt ways, the reality and foolish me that is not at all the way that the world operates. And very specifically, I started my career as a business journalist, and that's really what brought me around the world. And I'm really excited by the international experiences I had. But I also, when I then transitioned into the technology industry, one that's supposed to be, very innovative, good, very lucrative, certainly, a lot of innovation and all these buzzwords coming out. About a decade ago, I had a very painful experience being the only woman of color in the work that I did. I faced and certainly saw, biases, racism, sexual harassment, sexism writ large, in a way that, I was like, well, there are laws for this, and that's why HR exists, and actually found that there are many things that unfortunately, that there's just no recourse for it. And I, at a time where we weren't talking about, racism or bias or exclusion in any meaningful way, diversity meant the advancement of white women in the workplace. Lean in was the big, catchphrase of the moment. And that's what got me into this work. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. So Minda, same question. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to this work. And as you think about your books, maybe add a little bit about sort of and this is piggybacking on, right? You've written these books, and there's an arc, right? From the first book to this most recent book. So tell us a little bit about that arc as well.
Yes, again, thank you so much for having us. It's such a pleasure. I'm a big fans of your work, Dr. Coleman, and obviously Rashika, I admire you as a friend, as a thought leader, as a colleague as well. And so it's just a pleasure to be with two intellectual powerhouses that I admire the work that you do. So thank you so much. And I could not say that, especially as we wind down Women's History Month, right? So thank you both. So for me, really, it was similar to Rashika. Pain point, right? I never envisioned that I would be doing any type of diversity, equity, inclusion work. That was not on my bingo card, right? Like I never intended to.
I'm gonna mute myself so when I laugh, you don't have to hear me.
Yes, no, that was not the game plan, Dr. Coleman. But what I realized was that the workplace was not working for everybody the same. I'd spent 15 years in my previous life, and I'd hear so many of my white colleagues say, no, that's not racism. No, that's not sexism. And it's like, wait a second, when was the last time you were a person of color? When was the last time you were a woman? How would you know that this is? And then two things can be true at the same time, right? You may never experience the things that I experience, but then there's someone you work with that experiences them every day. So with that information, what are we doing to solve this problem, right? We can't dismiss it anymore. And it really was the impetus, Lean In was mentioned. when I read that book, I was at a very traumatic crossroads in my career, thinking like, God, I don't know if I can make it till retirement at this phase of being like traumatized in the workplace. You know, I'm in my 30s. I can't imagine staying in this life currently till I'm like 65. I just don't think I can make it, right? And I was thinking about that, and I read Lean In thinking that this was going to like solve it all, right? You know, that's how people were talking about this book. And two things can be true, right? It was giving what it needed to give for those particular groups. But for me, I just felt like I was left out of the career narrative. And it really made me start to investigate and interrogate what would it look like if we add women of color to this sentence, not an addendum, right? Not an asterisk. And so Toni Morrison said, write the book you want to read. And that's what I did with the memo. I said, you know what, we need to be talking about what affects women of color, Black and brown women, full stop. And I was nervous to do that. I didn't think that I was qualified, you know, as some of my peers in the space, but I realized that this was my contribution to making the workplace better than I found it. And that's what prompted me to do that work. But even when I wrote that first book, I never intended to be a consultant or any of those things. It just kind of came with the territory. But then the second book, Right Within, really just, I realized after being in a space for so long, there wasn't a day that I didn't go to work while I wasn't aggressed racially or sexually in some type of way. And I needed to deal with that pain, that trauma. It just doesn't go away when you quit your job or you get a promotion. It still sticks with you. And so I wanted to kind of talk about my journey to how my mental health was very much compromised in those environments, and how what freedom with healing could look like.
Thank you so much. And both of you brought up such important points. And even as we think about what's happened during COVID, and people keep talking about the Great Resignation and all of those things. And one of the things that we've seen in some of the articles is women of color don't want to go back to work. They don't want to go back to the microaggressions. They don't want to go back to the things, right, that were happening in some of the social events where they were excluded or included or harassed, or the various things that you all talked about. So this leads me to my next question, which I'm going to direct to you, Minda, which is really about, right, your book that's framed as a self-help book for women of color in the workplace, right? So can you speak and elaborate a little bit more on that idea of self-help, right? Network help, right? How we think about that space, particularly as some of the things that you both have described?
Yeah, you know, I started to think about this idea of, again, working at the same place, but experiencing it differently. And there are so many of us who are experiencing the workplace not at its best, not best in class, right? And it has affected our mental health. And when you are one of few or one of the only, you don't have anyone in these environments to affirm that your experiences. So what ends up happening when people constantly tell you that, no, that's not what it is, you don't know what you're feeling, right? You took it the wrong way, all of those sorts of things. Then you start to think you're the problem. And you're like, what could I do differently? And then you start to then silence your own self, right? Participating in your own oppression to some degree. And I realized that I had the power to redefine the narrative, right? And sometimes we just need to know what good could look like. What does dignity, equity, respect look like for everybody, not just some people? But while I was hoping, Dr. Coleman, that my allies would show up and my mental health would get better, I realized that it would take me some work, some inner work. Lauryn Hill said, how you gonna win if you ain't right within? I can't solve Scott's problems or Gina's problems, but I can start with myself, right? I can say, what is causing me this trauma, this pain, so that I can be my most healthiest self? My goal is no longer being my authentic self, it's being my healthiest self. Because if I do my healing work, then I'm gonna show up authentic. I'm gonna show up in the ways that I need to. And so for me, it was saying, hey, this is what healing is looking like for me. Let me be vulnerable about this journey, say it hurt like heck. It still hurts at times. I'm still triggered, but here's the tools that I found that have been helpful. And I think that's what I think Ruchika's books are about. My books are about. Your work is about providing people a framework, providing people a tool so that they can use it when they feel like they're alone. So we no longer have to suffer in silence, right? Like my book, Right Within, I dedicated it to Black women who were told that we had to be strong for everybody but ourselves, right? What would it look like if we take the power back? And so that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of being right within. We can't control the system necessarily, but we can start with the internal work, which will allow us to show up as our most healthiest, creating the boundaries that we need to with our colleagues so that we create more of an equitable environment.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you so much. And thanks for reminding us. I have this phrase about putting on our oxygen masks, right? Right, because before we can help others. And so thanks for reminding us about this important self-care and what that really means in terms of, right, that deep work that's needed. And so, and particularly for bringing up tools, right? This idea of tools and toolkits. And Ruchika, excuse me, I don't know what is happening. I'm having a little thing in my throat anyway. Ruchika, could you tell us a little bit about your work? And as you think about this, one of the things that your work does is, as Minda talked about, is the tools. And so as we're thinking about feedback here, right? So as people are receiving feedback, what we know is that there's often differential feedback along the way, right? So as people are engaging in these workplace environments, et cetera. And did I not say that? I thought I said, did I not say Ruchika or did I say Ruchika? I thought I said Ruchika, but if I didn't, I apologize. I apologize to you in front of everyone because I want to make sure that I am saying the name correctly. You write a lot of you write and you write about the role of feedback. So let's talk a little bit about that role of feedback and reflecting on the process, particularly as we think about hierarchies, right? Hierarchies in workplaces. We're here talking with lawyers, so there's hierarchy in the legal field. And so tell us a little bit about how people can give feedback. Think about the open and honest ways of constructive feedback. And also, if you could talk to us a little bit about that differential way that feedback can be given and the ways in which that can impact women, people of color, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. I actually wanted to say something that is a very important part of feedback that I really, part of sort of my learning about good feedback is the importance of keeping your mouth shut and not centering your story and your experience. And one of the very big aha moments I had is when I read Minda's book, The Memo. And I remember reading it and saying to myself and thinking to myself, okay, I feel really validated. This is a very important piece of writing. I feel it in my soul as a woman of color, but I am a non-Black woman of color. And so the important thing here is for me to, yes, understand and find solidarity in where I have been wronged and I have experienced racial trauma and racism, and also reflect on where I have been the oppressor, where I have used my privilege, you know, in negative ways, in ways that have caused harm. And reading Minda's book in many ways, and then of course others, you know, and Minda, but your voice and the way that you present your story with so much of vulnerability really continues to resonate in a way that, you know, few others can, honestly. That was the most sort of profound moment of feedback when I really think about my experience and my role in this work, in the work around inclusion in the workplace, as a non-Black woman of color. So I think the number one thing about good feedback and really receiving feedback and laying down your defenses is to not center yourself. If you are in a position of privilege, if you are in a position where you certainly, you know, and certainly I deal with stereotypes and microaggressions and all sorts of other things. And I also know that there are situations where I do have power and influence. And the minute I make this all about, here's where I don't, and this is where I have been oppressed, and center that experience, I'm not doing a good job, right? So I do want to center that in the work that I'm doing. Now, when it comes to effective feedback, the most important part of it is definitely the importance of being able to lay down your defenses. Not all feedback is going to be good feedback, and this is where the nuance is important. If you are someone with privilege, if you are someone with influence, and in situations, and of course that proximity can sometimes change, and someone comes to you and says, "Here's something you did. Here's some feedback I have for you on how this thing that you did was racist, or this thing that you did, this action that you took was a microaggression," that is an act of service and love, because that person has taken a huge risk in doing that. And again, the more hierarchical it is, if you are the head of the head, if you are the partner in the law firm, if you're the person with the corner office, and someone came to you and delivered feedback like that, who does not have the same position of privilege as you, it is an act of service and love. And that is very important in that moment, to lay down your defenses and really listen. Now, on the other hand, it shouldn't always fall upon people, women of color, women, people of color, people with other marginalized identities, to provide that feedback. And so the thing that I think both Minda and I feel very passionately about is psychological safety. And I think part of giving feedback is creating an environment where people feel safe to speak up and give feedback and know that their position, that their status, that their that they won't be threatened, essentially. And I did interview Minda in the book specifically on the chapter on psychological safety, because that's your expertise, and that is really profound, specifically centering how women of color very often feel psychologically unsafe. And that's terrible. It's terrible, certainly for women of color, but it is also terrible for the organization, because the benefits of psychological safety, innovation and growth and learning and closeness and collaboration are just they're so beneficial. Why would you not prioritize psychological safety? And why would you not prioritize creating it for people who have been underestimated and underrepresented?
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you starting with privilege and talking about privilege and linking it and having that sort of intersectional conversation right across, and thinking about the intersections therein. Also, of course, and I guess it's Baldwin, right, who says reserves the right to critique because we love it, right? So that's, I think that's a very important part, the labor part. And then this part about belonging, safety, and creating organizations that are innovative and thriving. And so picking up on that sort of concept, a little bit about, and I want to go and link these points, because some of what you all do, right, is link, and you tell your story, your books through story, right, through individual stories. And in many ways, those stories, and I was glad you actually brought that, I was going to bring that up about the interview, right, because it's not just stories about other people, but you all are talking to each other. So, right, so this idea of story and the idea of narrative, right, and what narrative does. And this goes back to some of the things that I think you both have been talking about centering and recentering, right, the stories of women of color. And so could you talk to us a little bit about this idea of story, of soliciting stories, the importance of story, what you learned, right, in this idea of creating story and narrative to actually move, right, this work forward. And so I forgot, I started, I'm going to Minda next. It's Minda, okay. This is what happens when you reach a certain point in life. You can't remember what you just did. So Minda, yes, starting with you first.
Oh, thank you. I have the same issue too. But yes, I think that storytelling is so important, right? And I think that it's some freedom when you finally feel like you can tell your story truthfully, right? James Baldwin also said that America likes to tell lies, right? And those lies are that we don't experience racism, we don't experience sexism. These are isolated situations, things of the sort. But one of the things that I realized was that once I gave myself permission to tell my story, it allowed other women to feel comfortable to tell their stories too, right? So now it's not just about my voice, it's not just about Ruchika's voice, it's the collective voice, right? And as we tell our stories, we're holding people accountable. And we are no longer allowing anybody else to tell the story for us. I don't need anyone else to tell my story. Now I've given myself permission to tell it. And I think when we tell our story, it holds records. I think of us as archivists, right? Like I'm telling my story so that it's on record, right? No one else can say that didn't happen to me because I've told you the story, right? Somebody else can hijack our narrative and say that, oh, these are isolated situations, but actually there's some common themes that women of color experience in the workplace. We just needed a space to be able to be vulnerable, right? Like other women have been given that opportunity to tell their stories for a very long time. But for some reason, we have not been able to have that privilege to tell our stories because they are painful, right? And some of it is the system, but then the other part of it is our freedom. And I find that if we get comfortable and normalize telling our stories, then it humanizes us, right? So it's no longer that happened to that person over there, but that actually happened to Minda. Now you have a face to it. Now you have a face to all three of us in our experiences, right? That humanizes. I'm somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's mother, right? And now think about if that was someone that you loved that's experiencing that, right? So I think the storytelling aspect, at least for me, allows some humanity. It allows for you to tap into a part of someone's emotional intelligence, their heart, right? To say that it could be better, right? We're not trying to, this isn't a got you moment. We don't want to label you ist, right? Whatever that ist is. But if you need to hear this story so that it allows you to stop functioning in that behavioral realm, then let's tell the stories. And it hasn't always been safe for us to tell it. I don't know that it's still safe for us to tell it, but we're in an interesting juxtaposition right now in history where if we don't tell it, who will, right? And so I applaud women who, or anyone for that matter, who feels comfortable, who has the courage to tell their truths, right? Because I believe that when we tell our truths, it allows someone else to be free too.
Thank you so much, Minda. And Ruchika, I'm going to pick this question up about story, right? And particularly, let's think about this idea of archivists, right? And this idea of the archive, and of course, this idea of humanity. And Minda, you so importantly pointed out, right, this importance of story in terms of undergirding, right, and dismantling in some ways, right, the lies or the narratives and documentation. So as we talk about this, Ruchika, could you talk to us a little bit about then thinking about this idea, right, of documentation, et cetera, in relation to providing support and guidance for women, right, and women of color in the workplace, and while also focusing, right, because we have the story, but then the larger systemic issues that we have to focus on and the simultaneity of that. So talk to us a little bit about that story and then coming to the institution. And let me say this, hold on to that question. Everyone out there, get ready to put your questions in the Q&A. You can start doing it now because we're going to come to Q&A. Okay, Ruchika's up.
Oh, wow, Dr. Coleman, I love this question. And I love everything that Minda said, because I also think of how part of using my privilege is I'm an immigrant woman of color, and some of the stories that I've been lucky to tell, both as a journalist and in this book, are stories of also there are immigrant women of color who, for many reasons, cannot tell their stories, right? Like I no longer am dependent on upholding anti-Blackness and complicit with white supremacy, like so many immigrants are forced to be to retain their rights to be in this country. So I did want to say that as well. I think the other thing with stories, and the reason why, you know, I've always believed in the power of stories. I think in a room full of, you know, I assume there are many people here who are part of the legal profession or will enter it in some way. One of the reasons why I believe in the power of story to demonstrate what this looks like is because most of the stories that I recount in my book, and actually in most of the work I've done as a journalist and the stories I've written, would not really stand up in court. There is no legal action I can take for my manager forgetting my name or mistaking me for the only other Indian woman or the only other woman of color in the room. There's no legal action I can take. There's no legal action I can take to being left out of the emails or not being invited to the golf or, you know, the social events. There were many social events I think of when I was in technology, in the technology industry, that I was left out of. White women on my team were not, but I certainly was. And there's no legal action I can take in that situation, can I? And that is where the power of story becomes really necessary, because if you want to dismantle systemic racism and sexism, yes, there is a very important part that the law, that legislation, we're in a very historic moment right now in this country, and hopefully will have a knock-on effect with our new Supreme Court nominee, and so we are in a historic moment indeed. And at the same time, there's a place for the law, and there's a place for all of that. And it's in these stories that we can really start to empathize. What does this really look like to experience sexism and racism? What is my role? And the way that I think a lot of people have been able to absolve themselves in dismantling these systems of oppression is saying to themselves, well, it's not like I have, authority. And it's only when you read books like Minda's, hopefully some of the stories in mine, will remind you that actually, no, you have the power in the moment as well, right? You do not need to be the top person in your organization to make change. It can be as simple and profound as getting, someone's pronouns correct. It can be as, quote unquote, simple as ensuring that when you're hiring from a diverse slate of candidates. So that's, that's for me, I think that's the power of story. It really can move us to action in a way that the data and research clearly hasn't, because the data around why diversity, equity, inclusion makes sense, decades old now. It's time to recognize how important and urgent this work is through the power of stories.
Thank you so much for talking about that power of story, particularly in relation, right, to the systematic and systemic, right, disruptions and how that can be useful and played out. And also for highlighting the importance of small change, right? Small changes. We sometimes think we have to go out and change the world and change a system, change our entire organization. And that probably is not possible given some of the exclusions, et cetera, that you all have highlighted and talked about. So I'm gonna now link this, and I only have 2 more questions for you also before the end. So this next question is really about language. And so both of you talk about and focus on the complexities of language, both in the way you write, right? And then you actually explicitly, right, address this. And so, Ruchika, I'm gonna start with you. And really because we started talking about systems, right? And so language is a system, right? And we know we enter into those systems of language in a variety of ways. And we could go on about English and all those things. So we could go down a whole road here, but I want to talk a little bit about that system of language and thinking about, right, how individuals really can be able to stay current, think about language and as it's emerging and staying current with what is happening now. And I will foreshadow for you, Minda, I'm going to ask you that same sort of question, but the last questions we're going to move into are questions around some takeaways from your books and thinking about women of color starting out in their careers. Okay, so Ruchika, go ahead, Ruchika, and you start off and then I'll go to Minda.
Yeah, Dr. Coleman, thanks. That's such a great question. And we know words have incredible power. There's this, and certainly, again, in an audience largely made up of folks in the legal profession, you all know how important, words are and how the right word in the right place can completely change the tenor and the meaning of a moment. So words matter a lot, certainly to me as a journalist and storyteller. I think a few things that I think are important is recognizing that language, of course, is evolving, and a lot of what we may have grown up with or we may have been socialized to believe is correct isn't, because so much of our language was created by people who were overrepresented in dominant groups who did not have to stop and think about how damaging and harmful and toxic language can be when it's not wielded responsibly. I think about things like pronouns, right? I grew up in Singapore. I grew up in a different place. And I, until recently, was also teaching. I taught at Seattle University. And I remember the first time that students walked into my class and we did our first class introductions. And I said, here's who I am. I'm Professor Ruchika Tulshyan, and people went on. the person who was after me, I said, all you have to say your name, what major you're doing, and, like one fun fact about you. And the person next to me said, hi, I'm so-and-so, and my pronouns are so-and-so. And this was, a number of years ago. And I was a bit like, why is this person doing that? Right. In that moment, I was like, not sure what's going on, but okay. And then saw how that did a knock-on effect. And then when the circle completed, it came back to me and I said, by the way, my pronouns are she, her. Then I went back and I did the work. I went back and I tried to understand what was this about. Again, grew up in a country where until recently, we do not, use pronouns in that way. We do not establish it in the same way. Unfortunately, homosexuality is still criminalized in Singapore, where I'm from. And so there was a lot of like, don't understand why this is important. And then doing the work of, oh, this is really important. And I need to change the way that I was socialized. I need to do the work. And I think we all need to be ready for that. The last point I want to make, which is probably the number one takeaway, is in doing the work of keeping current with evolving language, especially around racism, is the opportunity to decenter whiteness. I get really upset, really cheesed off when people say, do you know any diverse people? When you say diverse people, you are centering whiteness. You are centering maleness, right? We need to stop that. We need to be very clear and have that intentionality. And I have to say that the intentionality that we saw that has led to us having this historic moment in this Supreme Court confirmation, the intentionality of naming who was missing, exactly who was missing, and leading to the moment that we're in right now, that's what the power of language can do when you wield it responsibly.
Thank you so much. You covered so much: intentionality, linguistic patterns, doing the work, evolving language and linguistic patterns, and the histories of how language is built. So much. Thank you so much. And I just have to do a shout out. I have to do a shameless plug for our office. The reason you could put your pronouns into Zoom is because of partnership between our office and Zoom, because we realized early in the pandemic that the importance of expression. We initially worked with them on closed captioning, but then on the pronouns. So to your point, right, do the work, learn the importance, and then figure out how to apply and learn and make meaning. Minda, so picking up on this idea of language, doing the work, etc. The question that I'm going to ask you is really about, as we think about young women of color, as they're starting off in their careers and they're doing the work, they're doing what they can. Talk to us a little bit about some of the takeaways that you would like to suggest. And Ruchika, I'm going to follow up with you right after this to give us like 2 or 3 takeaways from you. But let's talk about some of these takeaways, particularly as you're navigating, right, these systems, these linguistic exclusions, all of those kinds of things. Take it away, Minda.
Yeah, that was so beautifully articulated, Ruchika. Thank you so much for that. Language is definitely important because, and I know that because all of us know that, but the language that's being used when we're young and how some of those early experiences with language show up later in our life and how we see ourselves, right? How we walk into a room. And for a long time, I used to always walk with my head down, right? And I didn't even realize that I was doing that. But I was always the only in spaces. And so I just kind of wanted to shrink in those ways, right? And so what's so important for, I think, young women of color particularly, is centering yourself now, right? Because I think oftentimes we are fearful. Audre Lorde said that we've been conditioned to value fear over ourselves, essentially. And I think when we are fearful of ourselves, we can't show up and be our best selves. We can't be our healthiest selves, right? And so the advice that I would give, especially from right within, is what would it look like if you gave yourself permission to show up for who you need to be, right? So for example, I keep this picture of myself. It's a baby Minda, right? I'm probably like 2 years old. Like I'm sitting on this little thing that my mom had. And when I think about the things that I do each and every day, I'm reminded of who that was and who I need to be to meet the future me, right? And so where you are right now, think about what boundaries do you need to create and practice right now so that when you do get to that difficult conversation that you feel good about it, right? That you know who you are before you have it, that no matter how that person meets you, you know who you are, right? Your worth is not tied to how they respond to you. And so I realized that as women of color, particularly, we have so much power. And I think the system has kind of shriveled us a bit that we forget that we do have power, right? And our power is in our voice. In the moment that we allow someone to silence our voice, then sometimes our power feels like it's not there. But you always have a voice. You just have to decide how you want to use it. And part of being right within is, I know I used to have courageous conversations, and then I would have an expectation of how that person should respond to me, right? Like I was hopeful that they would acknowledge that this has happened and they'd apologize and we'd go off into the sunset, but it was rarely ever that. Right? So what I learned about myself is that I can only control me. I can say what I mean without saying it mean. If they say sorry or for me, then that's great. But my worth is not tied to how they feel. That's their luggage, right? I'm no longer taking anyone else's baggage with me, but I can pat myself on the back because I created the boundary. And so boundary setting is self-care. So when you talk about self-care, it's not just the massages, it's not just the hot baths, it's those things too. But it's also making sure that people know what good looks like to you. Once you understand what good looks like to you, you'll be able to articulate that to other people.
What good looks like to you, setting the boundaries, and getting out of that fear zone, right? Getting out of that fear zone, knowing your triggers. And I love this, you've got that picture of yourself. I think that's just, and reminding yourself of where you need to be every day. I say this all the time. Sometimes people, when we look in the mirror, we see a problem because that's how we've been defined, right? So the question is to look in the mirror and not only not see yourself as a problem, but others, right? That we are solutions, we are assets. Ruchika, same sort of follow-up, tell us a little bit about some of that advice you would give. And I'm getting to the questions. I've got a couple now, so.
Oh my gosh, the way I felt that in my heart, Minda, what you said about, and what I heard for myself, and what I've always found, the solace I find in your work is that the power of forgiveness to ourselves and the self-compassion, because so much of the trauma that we then, so much of it is the gaslighting you experience in all these years that you're doing, that you're like doing the work in corporate America, and, you're doing the thing that, like, you're doing work that your ancestors couldn't even dream about. I'm the first woman in my family to work outside the home and paid work, and your first person to attend, 4-year college, like, yes. And then the gaslighting you do to try and cope, and all of that. So thank you. That work of healing is so important. I think for me the big takeaway from my book that I hope people see is that there is a very powerful social and political identity we have as women of color when we get together, and then of course our allies and our advocates, and as Minda's framing is, talks about, as well as what I've included in the book as her saying, is success partners, right? But people who have our back. But the reality is there is a coalition that needs to exist. And that's why sometimes when folks said, like, why did you use women of color? Why not just talk about immigrant women of color or Indian women or Asian women and all of that? And I said, that is a function of white supremacy to keep us apart and tell us that our struggles are different. In many ways, they are not. There are differences, but in many ways, we have all been harmed by similar systems. And secondly, the most important part is we can only rise when we all come together and rise. And I mean that in very specific ways. I think the way that many of our systems operate, especially in a corporate and a capitalist system, is the sharp elbows. There's only room for one woman of color author. And if Minda is that person, there's no room for me, right? Or there certainly is no room for the women coming up behind me. And I think that is such terrible thinking. That scarcity mindset is what causes so much of us, I think so many of us, not to be able to heal. And I've seen Minda literally demonstrate that part of that healing comes from when you make sure that the folks behind you don't get left behind, right? Because I think that's part of the hurt that comes from being in a system which wasn't built for you, right? And keeping all of us separate. So the fact that we can come together here, we can have a conversation where 3 women of color can have a conversation and be real with each other. Gosh, I mean, what I would have given for this even 10 years ago.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you for that about the power of coalition, because you're so right about, right, that divide and conquer sort of idea and those ideas that are circulated. So I'm going to get to these questions. So I have a couple questions and I'm going to direct them to you all. The first question is about the role of HR. So Ruchika, you might be getting that question given your reaction. The second question is really about thinking about this idea of that women of color, right, operate at high levels of excellence. And it says we consistently do the most at a high level. And we're always doing multiple things. How can we be valued without always doing all of those things all the time? Okay. And I have to say the last question I love, and I know that Minda has an answer for this one because we've talked before about this, but this is this introversion question. If you happen to be introverted, which of course no one thinks out there that the 3 of us are introverted. I can speak for myself as a suspicion that there's some other introverts here. How do you think about conflict in the workplace? So let's start with the HR question. You want to take that, Ruchika? You could take that one maybe, and then we'll go to the women of color. Maybe both of you can answer that, and then we'll end with introversion. Maybe Minda, you can take that one. So we've got about 8 minutes left.
Okay, I'll go first and I'll be brief because I definitely want to make sure all the questions get answered. It is completely the role of companies, company leaders. The more privilege and power you have, the more this is truly what you should be driving. In all the research I've done, especially when I was researching for my first book on gender balanced organizations, I found that across countries, across location, across size, across industry, there was only one thing that gender balanced companies had in common, and that was leadership buy-in. So we do know that this needs to come very largely from the top down. Now, that doesn't mean that folks, who are not in executive roles, and we know, unfortunately, the numbers show largely not women of color, that doesn't mean we don't have power of coalition. And we know certainly what's happening in Florida right now. Workers have the ability, when we, again, build coalition, we can make change. But it is absolutely the responsibility of company leaders, of HR. One of the reasons I wrote this book is so that I would not hear again, oh, I see I see the importance of diversity and inclusion. I don't know where to begin, so I'm just not going to.
Thank you very much. So now this idea of doing the most, we operate at this high level. How can we be valued without doing the most all the time? Minda, let's get a minute on that, Ruchika a minute, and then we'll come to the introversion. And I've got another question that just came in.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it comes from the system. The system has told us that we have to work 10 times harder than everybody else. So we're already coming with the armor on that we have to work 10 times harder. That's the only way. I mean, that's how I entered the workplace. And so because we've always been held to a best in class standard, and we've accepted that as well, we don't know what it might feel like just to do your work and go home. And so I think that is part of self-care, that we don't have to be all things to everyone in the workplace. And I think that's part of the right within, right? That I no longer have to show up and work 10 times harder to get half as much. That's no longer a narrative that I can play into, right? Long story short, a friend of mine had recently gone through an evaluation of one-on-one reviews, and we were joking because they were saying that she met expectations. But she's the go-to person for everything. She's the first there, in the mornings, at the end, everybody goes to her. And we made a joke. I said, well, since they said that your only meets expectations, I hope you show up tomorrow and you only meet expectations. No longer exceeding, right? Because your meets expectations is way better than half of your colleagues, right? So I think for us, we have to decide who we want to be going forward in the workplace. If our personality is doing the most, then do it because you want to. Don't do it because we're centering dominant culture. Do it because that's what your work ethic is, but also allow yourself some space to say, I'm a good employee. I don't have to go above and beyond if I don't choose to. Again, I think it is a choice that we can make for our work.
Great. That is just, thank you so, thank you so much. And we have more time. I at my clock, I didn't realize we have we have 15, 20 minutes. So let's get to, Ruchika, do you want to follow up on that and tell us a little bit about this idea of this over achievements sometimes?
I mean, everything Minda said, and I'll add that there's actual research that shows that women and people of color get assigned what academic research calls office housework. And this is the non-glamorous work that does not lead to promotion or tenure or whatever the advancement is called in your field. And disproportionately, women and women of color most disproportionately are completing this office housework. So in the beginning, we're like, oh yes, of course we'll take the meeting notes. Of course we'll be the first in, we'll be the last out, we'll do all the things, we'll sit on all the committees. And we don't get promoted and we don't get advanced. And we, if we're lucky, we are in the meets expectations, bucket. And the reality is that women of color, we do need to step back from completing that office housework. We need to set the boundaries that Minda talked about, because not only is it a function, again, of whiteness and this idea of white professionalism that forces us or makes us feel like that's the way that we're going to advance, but there's actual research to show that it does the exact opposite. It actually puts you into that bucket of, oh, Ruchika, yeah, she's a hard worker. She's, but she's never going to get into the leadership role. Of course, we'll have her do the, sort of the back office work. Why would she ever meet clients or be in a sales position? She just doesn't have it in her. So do be careful of office housework.
Thank you for those important
Dr.
reminders.
Coleman, can I
Yes,
add
of
something
course.
really quick to what you said?
Of course.
When Ruchika said that, it reminded me of a manager that I had back in the day, and he told me that you're a utility player, Minda. You can do anything. We can put you anywhere, and we know you're going to do a great job. And when he said it, it actually made my skin crawl, because I didn't want to be looked at as a utility player. I wanted you to be thinking about how to advance my career. I'm doing these things because I see myself as a leader, because I thought that's what I'm supposed to do. So to Ruchika's point, it's not necessarily helping us doing all this extra stuff. So I think we have to get really clear about why we're doing it and who we're doing it for and all those sorts of things.
Thank you for sharing these stories, etc. It's really important. And I think, again, this even goes back to the language and the way that language is coded, right? And how people are talked to, etc. Right? That your utility. I remember once someone said to a group of people of color in a PhD program, well, it's great because you all will be public intellectuals. You won't be the tenured professor intellectuals. You'll be the others. Exactly. You can imagine I did well with that conversation. So, but right, that's the kind of linguistic, right, systems of then exclusion that you all have illustrated so well. So let's get to this idea about introversion. There's this idea that people like you, Minda, people like you, Ruchika, you're all extroverts. You are out there. So talk to us a little bit about, because this question is, if you're an introvert, or you're adverse to conflict, or you're the only at the workplace, what advice could you give to a person in terms of thinking about speaking up, helping to develop those boundaries, or that to move beyond the fear, right? The things that you all have talked about. So why don't I start with you this time, Minda, and then I'll come back to you, Ruchika.
Yes, so I am of the Ministry of Introversion. I belong to that church, a very active member. And I realized that while I was working hard and nobody knew what I was doing because I wasn't articulating my value and quantifying my worth, I just thought that if I worked hard, people would acknowledge that and move forward. And what I realized was that part of my career trajectory, part of my success required me to let people know what I was doing, right? Advocating for myself. That's part of self-care, is advocating for yourself, self-advocacy. It's very strong when we activate it. And so I realized that I didn't have to be like the life of the party on the Zooms. I didn't have to be the one cracking the jokes. I just needed to be strategic, right? So when I did go to the happy hours, when I do go to the Zoom functions that, who are the people that I just need to either direct message or, how can I show my face for 15 minutes? I don't have to stay the entire time. So I figured out how to be engaged. That was where I started, right? I don't have to be an extrovert, but what feels comfortable to me, what is authentic to me. And once I figured out what my comfort level was, then I leaned into it. Right. And so for me, I always kind of thank God after a talk, because I'm like, who is this person? I never imagined that I would be talking in this way, because I'm really not deathly afraid, but very afraid of public speaking at one point in time. Very, very uncomfortable place to be. But I realized again that part of our freedom, part of being right within, is making sure that our stories are being told. If we're not in the space to advocate for ourselves or advocate for others, then they're missed opportunities, right? And then someone else gets to say that Minda's a utility player. Now, if I'm here and say it, now I get to show you that I'm not, right? and that is important to it, the power of narrative. And so again, think about the scale, the spectrum. You don't have to be the 10 all the time, but what do you need to be to make sure that you're still showing up and that you're being engaged, and find those authentic ways that make you still feel comfortable. But growing is part of pushing ourselves, right? So it's important that we challenge ourselves so we can be our best selves.
Thank you for talking about self-advocacy, strategy, and of course, really thinking about how we how we move together, right? And so in these spaces. Rachika, do you want to add anything to this question?
Yeah, I'll be really quick. A little bit like Lean In, the narrative around, the power of quiet, or Quiet by Susan Cain, and the importance of introverts. Really great research that shows introverts are, excellent, great leaders. They do all these awesome things. And to Minda's point, for women of color and people of color with various marginalized identities, we don't have that luxury of not advocating for ourselves and others. We don't have the luxury of not advocating for ourselves, or not constantly, at least strategically, telling people what we're up to. And for someone to magically be like, oh, Rachika, you're in the corner. Let me think of you for this incredible opportunity. It's just not going to happen. I just want to be honest, okay? Because I really wish, I'm personally an extrovert, but I have been around a lot of introverts all of my life. And unfortunately, while we are working hard, all of us doing our work to change the system, at this point, to get ahead, indeed, you do have to be strategic in how you show up, who you build coalition with. And I cannot emphasize that enough, especially again, if you're the only one of the very few.
Thank you so much. Thank you both, because you're exactly right. And thanks for reminding us that, yeah, it's not magic, and it's not going to magically happen as much as we wish it might be a level playing field or equitable in those ways. So, Rachika, this question is for you, and it's about the point that you made about women of color being harmed in similar ways, right? And so how do you think about balancing that against the fact that, of course, people have been harmed in different ways, right, historically, that they have, right, different levels of privilege. And in this question, the person who asks it is, excuse me again, I'm sorry. Clearly I'm having something going on today. The person who asks it actually asked this question about the model minority myth and how it's been used, weaponized to separate, right, different groups, or other kinds of things that are used to separate different kind of groups. So just talk a little bit about that, and thinking about that specificity.
There's so much to unpack, and I obviously want to be mindful of time. Firstly, I just want to say even the demographic of Asian is completely imprecise and incomplete. And I talk about this in the book. Obviously, Asian and Asian American constitutes, tens of countries, hundreds of languages and cultures, languages, dialects, et cetera, religions. So just for the sake of, again, centering whiteness, the term Asian and Asian American, I have to say, was definitely created as a political identity, a social and political identity in the 60s, in solidarity with movements around the civil rights, et cetera. However, when folks say Asian, they mean so many languages and cultures, and unfortunately that flattens us. So that is something that I want to acknowledge in the very little time I have. What I want to say is, by getting so focused on, on getting granular, I think there are times where it is important to be specific. Where I am specific, it's when I name my privilege. And I think it's really important to name your privilege and be specific in those moments. I am not standing here talking about cultures and experiences that I have not experienced. I will use data to make my case. I'll say data shows Black women have this experience in the workplace. I will obviously, in my role as a storyteller and a journalist, as someone who really deeply believes in crediting the person, I will say this person whom I interviewed said this. I use journalistic ethics for that. However, I also think we get very, very caught up in separating ourselves without realizing how important this work is when we build it together in solidarity. And I can already say that. I mean, just the fact that Minda and I are sitting here on the same panel, we had the really fun experience of doing that 2 years ago at a very large conference in Silicon Valley, where it was the first time ever that conference had had a panel fully made up of women of color of all different identities. And the number of people who came up to us afterwards and then online, this is the last conference I attended before COVID, it was February 2020, little did we know, the level of solidarity, of healing, of comfort, of recognizing that we're in this together. Yes, certainly our experiences might be different. If we get too caught up in that, we are not going to be able to build the type of coalition we need to dismantle that. So I know this is a complex question. I do want to acknowledge that there's nuance. I do want to say it's important not to say, well, oh no, I as an Asian woman, I have no role in this fight. You really do. We know, unfortunately, with the rising violence against Asian, again, especially Asian and AAPI women in this country, for many folks who might have thought, well, I don't have anything, I don't have a role to play in this. You do. It's really important for us to work together in this.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that comprehensive answer and for the specificity of talking about both the coalitions and then the ways in which, again, we have to think about our privileges, our differences, and the authenticity that it takes to be able to do that, right? And also, of course, this use of data and research, because we have to, sometimes I think we can, it's important that we are researchers, that we are people who do that kind of work, and that informs the work that we do. Let me ask this next question, which is really about tips. So this is a concrete question, and we only have a few minutes. So I've got a lot more questions here. So I'm gonna group some questions and kind of try to get through the rest of them. So the first question is about housework, right? And how to do the housework and still be a team player. So how do you not do the housework and still be seen as a team player? The second question goes back to HR. I have a feeling some people out there have some feelings or thoughts about HR, but how do we reimagine HR, right? Particularly as we think about the investigatory natures of some, right, HR wings, meaning in terms of Title IX or OEO, right, that they'll own that within the HR function. So a little bit about thinking about HR and organizational cultures. Okay, the next question is really, these next couple of questions are really about adversity. So what do you do if your company doesn't want to have any of these conversations? In fact, they're unhappy that you're even here at this Minda conversation. No, I'm just kidding. But how do we deal with that, right, situation? And then lastly, if you could just talk a little bit about the coalition. So here's what I'm going to say, and the emotional labor. So here's what I'll say in terms of the questions. We're going to do this rapid fire. Okay. I know. I'm pushing you here. So, okay. So housework, Minda, tell me about housework and being a team player. Ruchika, we're going to go to you next. Reimagining HR. You got 30 seconds each.
Well, housework, it is what it is. We aren't the help, right? So I think that you can be part of the solutions and ask for stretch assignments and those sorts of things, but don't volunteer to take the notes. Don't volunteer to order the cake. those sorts of things. So take that out of the way and only volunteer for things that you think are adding to your short-term and long-term goals. But I think as women, we like to raise our hand for those sorts of things. Let somebody else take the notes next time. Let somebody else do the phone calls or whatever the case may be. So I think we just have to intentionality. I think it's been a theme here today. Be intentional about the things that we're gravitating to and let go of some of those things that are no longer serving us.
Great. Intentionality and strategy. All right. Rachika, this question is about that HR, reimagining HR, organizational culture, etc.
Yeah, I've been lucky to meet some amazing folks in HR trying to reimagine it. So I will say it's not, I mean, yes, widely HR's job is to protect the organization, and I will absolutely collude to that. People are like, oh, you know, I don't think that's true. And nope, it is. Their job, their function is to protect the organization. Let's be really clear here. I see people making changes in HR for a variety of reasons, just from the fact that our generation and generations coming up after us are not going to accept, not having an inclusive culture of belonging. So there's that. I think the last point I'll make in this quick rapid fire is the role of, again, back to like, if literally you fell asleep and you woke up and this is the only thing you take away, is the coalition. And I think employee resource groups, being able to build allyship and advocacy together in coalition, having those, again, that power in numbers and the strength in numbers to surface issues to the organization, super important. It does not have to only be through HR.
Great. And the last question, and this is directed toward you, Minda, is how do we balance coalition building with other minority groups and the burden of carrying the added emotional labor? And you only have 30 seconds because I actually do have one final question to close us out.
Well, Rachika really did such a fabulous job of answering that earlier, but I think we have to remind ourselves that success is not a solo sport, right? If one of us are harmed, all of us are harmed. So we can't just rely on white men and women to show up as allies. We need to be showing up for each other in these ways as well. And so I think building the coalition is saying that if AAIP, my friends are hurting, then that's hurting Black women too, right? So what can I do to show up for that? And so I think we all have to see each other's inequalities as our own until all of us are free.
Thank you. Oh, yes.
I want to validate that indeed women of color, sometimes non-Black women of color, can be really, really terrible. I want to validate that. We can perpetuate harm. We can be the oppressors too. And unfortunately, not enough of us have understood our role in upholding both white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And that is the work that we need to do. And that is one of the reasons why I am in this work. I am not in this work because I want to speak for Black women or Latinx women or other women. I'm really in this work because there are people in my community and communities adjacent to mine that perpetuate harm, that need to acknowledge their privilege and understand how they are causing harm too.
Thank you both. You can't see this in the necessarily, but we're getting all kinds of accolades, congratulatory notes, etc., and just saying what an amazing panel this is and what amazing information people are receiving. So we're going to close this out, and I have one final question for you both. Are there books, resources, etc., that you would recommend to people out there? We have a lot of emerging leaders out there, I'm sure, in the audience. We've got emerging lawyers, right? And we know we've got co-sponsors, women from the leadership group. We've got people from the Stern School. So any suggestions about resources, etc., and to underscore, right, this idea of an inclusion mindset, right, and the very things that you all have underscored, inclusion with purpose and getting right within. And whoever wants to start can start. And let me just say this, get the books out there, read the books. Okay.
So I would definitely just echo that Rachika has 2 books out in the world. So make sure that you add those to your resources. She also has a list of great articles and resources through Harvard Business Review, New York Times. So make sure that you add all of those to your collection, and also look at your book list. If you are only reading a certain type of demographic or age or race, then switch it up. Go on to the bookstores and make sure that you're diversifying the people that you're reading and the content that you're consuming as well.
And I absolutely feel like the memo and Right Within and all the amazing work, Minda, you put out, really hard work, right? Because some of you have talked about healing. Really, when you think about healing, it begins in knowing that you're not alone, right? And Minda, I remember when you said you wrote the memo as a love letter to women of color, to Black women, it was clear. It's that validation, like, oh, it's not just me, that gaslighting. It's not just, is what just happened to me. And I can't recommend your book enough. The other one, the other book that I really learned a lot from, and so glad, again, as someone who has a global sort of perspective, is Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. I cannot recommend it enough. It helped so much, again, for me as an immigrant, as someone who, came to this country without enough of the context. Fortunately, I had good training in history, but without enough of that context and that lived experience to see, actually, again, there are issues we've had that are so similar around the world, right? And that we can learn from. So that's one.
Thank you so much for that, both of you, for those resources. And I will say, you can actually see Isabel Wilkerson on our YouTube channel. We did a discussion with her through our journalism school most recently. And so we can get that resource out, but it was a wonderful discussion. And you're exactly right, thinking about this idea of caste and how we really reimagine these spaces, particularly underscoring diversity, equity, inclusion. It has been a delight. It has been a delight to be in conversation with the two of you. I've learned even more. I try to be a learner, and so I've learned even more about your work and about the important contributions that you're making. I want to again thank everyone out there for participating today, and of course to my own office. I co-sponsored, but thank you to the NYU Women's Leadership Forum, to the Center for the Future of Management, the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at the Law School, NYU, LACA, the law school, WOCC, and of course, Wagner's BSA. And of course, to everyone out there, thank you again. And thank you to all the people behind the scenes. We hope that you continue to take really good care. Be strategic, and be intentional. Be well.
Thank you all so much for being here and for joining us. And Dr. Coleman hit all of our co-sponsor thank yous, and we reiterate those from the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. So have a great rest of your evening, and we will see you all soon. Thank you again.